Hello and welcome to the Providence College Podcast. If you missed watching the Friar Forum with two former presidential candidates, Friar Dad Chris Christie and Friar Granddad Michael Dukakis, catch up with this episode of the PC Podcast. Christie and Dukakis addressed the upcoming election, shared stories of their lives in politics in a less divisive time, and encouraged students to become involved in public service.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's Friar Forum, which is part of our Homecoming at Home series of events that will go through October. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Father Ken Sicard. I am the 13th president of Providence College. I just succeeded Father Brian Shanley on July 1st at a very interesting and challenging time. But one of the advantages of doing this remotely is that so many of our alumni and parents and students and faculty and staff will be able to participate, whereas otherwise they wouldn't have been able to join us tonight. And so I am delighted to welcome all of you, and I'm especially delighted to welcome our guests this evening, former Governors Chris Christie and Michael Dukakis. And Governors Christie and Dukakis have not only agreed to share with us their perspectives on the upcoming election, they've also shared something even more important because they've entrusted their son and granddaughter, respectively, to Providence College to be educated by us. And we are delighted to have them here. And I just heard from them that they're both having a wonderful experience here at Providence College, and we're so happy about that. Now, Governors Christie and Dukakis are notably different in their politics, so I'm sure tonight's conversation is going to be very, very interesting, and we'll hear a lot of contrasting opinions from each of them. But our students will be reminded of engaging in the Dominican practice of the disputed question, and they'll feel like they're in class again. So, Governors, you honor us by your presence, and I am delighted to turn you over to our moderators, Dr. Joe Camerano, who's the chair of our political science department, and Julia Murphy, class of 21, who is a poli-sci major. I'm so looking forward to this, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Father.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Father Sicard. Welcome. We're honored to be here tonight to have a thoughtful discussion with two very experienced public servants, to ask them to reflect on their public service careers, particularly in these kind of strange times where a lot of people might be turned off. We want to hear why they think maybe public service is a good thing for us to do, to consider and to do. As you know, both guests are former governors of states that send a lot of students to Providence College, and not just from their respective families. Both of them have law degrees. The Honorable Chris Christie served as governor of the state of New Jersey from 2010 to 2018. He was active in local, state, and presidential campaigns since at least the 1980s. Governor Christie also served as U.S. Attorney for New Jersey from 2002 to 2008, where he oversaw several high-profile and very important prosecutions, including for corruption, public corruption. Before that, Christie was an elected member of the Morris County, New Jersey Board of Freeholders, which is essentially a legislative body for a county, from 1995 to 98. But his formal political career traces at least as far back as high school, when he served as class president at Livingston High School in New Jersey. And I actually went to college with some people who probably voted for him. The Honorable Michael Dukakis has the distinction of being the longest serving governor in the history of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. He served from 1975 to 1979, when he decided, in what may be the most generous display of bipartisanship, to allow a Republican to try his hand at being governor. In 1983, he decided he had enough of that, and he served 2 additional consecutive terms, leaving office in 1991. In his time as governor, Dukakis built a solid reputation for what we public administration scholars call reinventing or right-sizing government. And he earned the distinction of most effective governor from the National Governors Association in 1986. And he has served as distinguished professor of political science at Northeastern University and as a visiting professor at UCLA for over 20 years. We are honored and delighted to have both Governor Christie and Governor Dukakis. Starting the conversation will be Julia Murphy. I want her to do most of the moderating. She's a senior political science major, varsity athlete, currently the only senior out of 62 poli-sci majors writing a year-long senior honors thesis. Julia is from Pittsfield, Massachusetts, where she lives when she isn't locked down in an off-campus apartment. And she has way too many honorifics to mention here. Instead, I'll simply turn it over to you, Julia, to begin.
Thank you, Dr. Camarano, and thank you to both Governor Dukakis and Governor Christie for being here tonight. This is an extraordinary event for our community. We have over 700 people tuned in from home this evening, which is so remarkable, and we're very fortunate to have both of you as part of our extended Friar family. So, in thinking about where we might begin our conversation tonight, I thought it would make sense to kind of start from the beginning of your public life. So we'll start with you, Governor Dukakis. Can you speak a little bit about what is it that drew you to public service? How did you get interested in politics, and what has kept you in politics for as long as it has?
I'll try to keep this brief, Julie. I may be a little windy. I was very fortunate. Both of my parents were Greek immigrants. My dad came over here when he was 15, my mother when she was 9. My father came here in 1912. And 12 years later, graduated from Harvard Medical School. How he did it, I have no idea. Remember, he was here, came here as a 15-year-old. 12 years later, graduates from that medical school. Practiced medicine in Boston for 52 years. And I was supposed to succeed him until I ran into something called general physics at Swarthmore College, which I couldn't get. My mother came from Central Greece. Came in when she was 9, family settled in Haverhill, which was a shoe town in those days, shoe manufacturing. And thanks to an elementary school principal named Stanley Gray, if you want to know where I got the middle name Stanley, it's for Mr. Gray. She was the first Greek girl, so far as we can determine, who went to college unescorted and went to Bates College in Lewiston, Maine, in 1921. Graduated Phi Beta Kappa in 1925. Because in those days, Greek girls did not go away to college. Became a school teacher, married my dad. So I was very fortunate. I'm not sure either one of them was political, but the CBS World News Roundup on radio, this is pre-TV, was always on at 6 o'clock at night. And for whatever reason, at a relatively early age, I got interested. And especially got interested in what I saw as injustices in the society that I was living in. I mean, I'm talking about 9 or 10. I grew up in the town of Brookline, which, if you know anything about the geography of metropolitan Boston, is about 3 miles from downtown Boston. People of color could not live in the town of Brookline, with 3 exceptions. 2 janitors lived in basements, and a world-renowned tenor somehow got somebody to sell him a house in Brookline. That was it. And for whatever reason, this 9 or 10-year-old looked at the situation and said, this is terrible. Why isn't my town? Now, don't ask me why or where all of this came from. And part of that involved beginning to get actively involved in school politics, and I know both of us probably did that. President of Student Council, that kind of stuff. Went off to a place called Swarthmore College I'd never heard of, just outside of Philadelphia, right in the middle of the whole McCarthy era. And that was the beginning of my involvement politically. And the rest, as I say, is history. And I've never regretted it. And I hope, Chris, one of the things we'll be able to do tonight is to encourage these 700 kids and a lot of other folks to think seriously about public service as a career. I mean, there's nothing like it. To be in a position where you can make a difference in the lives of your fellow citizens is a very special privilege. And we both had an opportunity to do that. And I know he feels strongly about it, and so do I. And I hope we can encourage lots and lots of Providence College students tonight to think seriously about public service as a career.
I totally agree, Governor. I really do. And I would say that, you know, for me, how it started for me was no one in my family, sounds like the governor, no one from my family was involved in politics. You know, my dad was a CPA. Came from a family where his dad passed away when he was 17 years old, and so he was quite young when he lost his dad, and they had no money. My dad worked during the day in the Breyers ice cream plant in Newark, New Jersey, and went to school at night at Rutgers in Newark and studied for his CPA. And my mom, also born in Newark, New Jersey, as was I. My mom was a secretary at Remington Typewriter Company, and so they always voted, and I think very much like Governor Dukakis' family, they were listening to the news. The news was a important part of what we were expected to participate in with them every day. But the first time I remember being interested in politics, the real influence from politics was my grandmother, my Sicilian grandmother, who, when she passed away at 91 years old, we found shoe boxes in her closet of letters that she got from members of Congress over the years, that she had wrote to them about every subject that she was concerned about, and she kept every letter they sent back. So she was very interested in public life. Not a highly educated woman, but
let me interrupt. Was she an immigrant herself?
No, she was first generation.
Her parents came over.
Her parents came over, absolutely.
But you have Greek blood in your coursing through your veins, because we settled Sicily. I mean,
that's right. I mean, there's no doubt. And I can't tell you, when they see my last name, how many people think and look at me and think I'm Greek.
Greek.
I get asked that all the time. And my grandmother was a huge influence. She was first generation. My grandfather, her husband, was actually born on the boat coming over to America. And when you think about what they went through to come over here, and for a woman to actually give birth on her way over is pretty extraordinary in the conditions that they were in. But my grandmother, in August of 1968, I was 6 years old, and my grandmother told me that I was going to come to her apartment and we were going to watch the Democratic National Convention together for all 4 days. And I was going to stay with her.
And you were 6.
And I was 6 years old. And she took, and as those of you who've studied this, and I know the governor and I remember this, that was quite a convention to watch, and quite an initiation into politics. And we watched that convention together. And from that time on, I was incredibly interested in politics, and became a Republican when I was in high school. And a guy who was running for governor came to my high school to speak in 1977. And he came and spoke, and I came home that night to my mother and said, I love this guy. He seems so interesting. I'd like to volunteer for his campaign. And he actually lived in our hometown. So my mother, being the aggressive Sicilian mother she was, she said, well, get in the car, we'll go to his house. And I was petrified. And we drove up this long driveway, and we got to the top, and she said, well, go knock on the door. And I said, well, will you come in with me? She goes, no, you're the one volunteering, not me. And I walked up to the front door and knocked on the door, and the guy who answered the door was Tom Kean, former New Jersey.
A wonderful guy, wonderful
guy. And that night, he came out to speak to my mother, and he said, what's he doing tonight? And she said, well, he's got some homework to finish. And he looked at me and said, go home and finish your homework. If you get back here by 6 o'clock, I'm going out on a campaign stop tonight. I'll take you.
Okay.
He did. He took me to the VFW hall in Paramus, New Jersey, Bergen County, and I put the sheets of paper on each one of the chairs before people got there with his platform. He lost that race for governor in 1977 in the primary, but came back 4 years later. And the amazing thing was, I first went and did this in February of 1977, and 32 years later, in February of 2009, he endorsed me for governor. So that was my start in politics, and it was all because of my Sicilian grandmother and Tom Kean were the two people who inspired me.
One of the most decent people I've ever worked with in public life.
Extraordinary guy. Extraordinary guy. And I absolutely agree with the governor. I'm now out in the private sector for 3 years after having been in the public sector for 15 as U.S. attorney and then as governor. There is nothing like public service to feel fulfilled every day and to feel challenged every day and to feel like you're really doing something great for people that you'll probably never meet and certainly never know. And that's a pretty amazing thing to be able to do. So I'm with the governor on this. Every one of the folks who are lucky enough to be at Providence College, if you do just a little bit of your life in public service, you'll be very grateful for having done it.
And if you get into it in a serious way, there's nothing like it.
Nope,
Nothing like it.
Well, thank you. I try to tell my students that, but it's probably better that they hear it from people who actually do it. So you both raised Tom Kane, who I also know very well. He was my boss for a while when I taught at Drew University. And, you know, he is held up often as the best example of his generation of a governor who may have been in one political party, but was able to work closely with people on the other side of the aisle. And so I'd like to raise this issue because, you know, one of the phenomena that we've seen is this increasing difficulty that we have in bridging that partisan divide. And both of you have experience and successful experience doing that. I'm wondering whether you could talk a little bit about how that's done these days. And, you know, share some of your wisdom from the past, but maybe comment a little on how it can be done today. And, you know, Governor Christie, why don't you start?
Well, listen, I'm unlike Governor Dukakis, who is a Democratic governor of what is predominantly a Democratic state, although he has a Republican governor right now, a friend of mine, Charlie Baker. I was a Republican governor in a very blue state in 2009. The state that Tom Kane won in 1981, significantly different state than the state that I governed in 2009. I had a completely Democratic legislature in their majorities for all 8 years that I was governor. The president of our Senate was the president of the Iron Workers Local in our state. And my first speaker was an African-American woman who is now the lieutenant governor of New Jersey, Sheila Oliver. What I did right after I was elected in 2009 was I unexpectedly dropped in as governor-elect on the Senate president. Now, his office is a 2.5-hour drive or so from where I live in New Jersey. So I just got in the car with the troopers and said, take me down to Senator Sweeney's office. I showed up unannounced. He was there. And we went into a conference room and I said to him, Steve, we need to make a decision now. Are we going to work together or are we going to fight each other for 4 years? Because I could do either one, but I'm coming down here because I want us to work together. And he was completely stunned that I had come down there. And he looked at me and he stood up, he put out his hand and he said, you came down here just to deliver that message? Then I'm with you. Let's work together. And we shook hands. And I did the same thing with Sheila Oliver. And I think the biggest key, and I think what is so missing from politics today, is that people don't develop personal relationships. You have to spend time with people on the other side of the aisle, and your own side of the aisle for that matter, but certainly the other side of the aisle, and develop a personal relationship. You know, I used to say to my staff all the time when a Democratic legislator would be doing something we didn't like or saying something we didn't like, and I'd say, call him down here. I want to see him. No. Don't elevate him or her, you know, to do that, to come to the governor's office. No, don't reward bad behavior. And I'd say, no, bring him down. And I would sit and talk with them. And I'm sure Governor Dukakis experienced this when he was governor. They would sit down, those legislators, and they'd be looking around that governor's office thinking, oh boy, maybe someday it could be me. It's definitely a bit of a home field advantage. And they'd be looking around. But the other thing that I learned is it's much harder to hate up close. You know, when you're sitting in a room with someone, when you get to know them personally, when you learn about their spouses, their children, their schooling, their what got them to the point where they are now, it's a lot harder to hate up close. And I think the problem, especially in Washington, D.C. these days, the biggest problem is that no one stays there except for 3 days. They don't have dinner together anymore for the most part. They don't go out for drinks together. They don't socialize together. They're either on the airplane or on the Amtrak to get back on, you know, Thursday night and don't get back until Monday night. Personal relationships are so important because that's where personal trust comes from. And I think that was the key to my success. We did so many things in a bipartisan way in New Jersey in my 8 years because I worked hard on those relationships. And by the way, my friends on the other side of the aisle, they worked hard at it too. Because, I wasn't always the easiest guy in the world to get along with. So, we had moments where there was conflict. I'll give you one quick story and then turn it over to the governor. At one summer, I was right after the budget in a horrible argument with the Senate president over line item vetoes that I had done to the budget. And he was very angry and went public about how angry he was, and he wouldn't return any of my phone calls. And I went to do an event, a Green Acres event. The governor, I'm sure, did plenty of these in Massachusetts, where I was preserving some farmland, and we were going to do a press conference there. And it was one of the hottest, most humid days of the summer. And I have asthma, and I had an asthma attack. And they had to rush me to the hospital. It became national news. And I'm in the hospital, and the Senate president calls me to leave what he thinks is going to be a message on my cell phone. But I actually was feeling fine, and my cell phone was there, and I answered it. And I said, "Steve?" And there was silence on the other end of the phone. And he said, "Governor, are you okay?" He said, "I mean, I have to tell you, all the rest of this stuff is just bullshit." He goes, "You're not going to die, are you?" I said, "No, Steve, I'm not going to die." He goes, "Listen, when you get out of the hospital, let's go out for dinner and let's just settle all this stuff, okay?" Now, Steve called me because he was personally worried about me. That wouldn't happen if we didn't have a personal relationship. And we then went and had dinner 4 nights later. We settled our differences. I gave him something that he didn't think I'd give him that he wanted. He was happy. We moved forward in a positive way. And it's all about personal relationships. And I think that's the biggest thing that's missing, Joe, today is those personal relationships. Because if you don't have them, you don't have trust. And if you don't have trust, you're not willing to make a deal with someone you don't trust.
Why is that happening?
Well, I think Governor Christie actually is onto something. There's one of my distinguished mentors, Ross Baker at Rutgers, wrote a book back in 1980 entitled Friend and Foe in the U.S. Senate. And he discussed the importance of these informal relationships that create opportunities. And that's a really important missing element now, that they're just not mingling. They're not even, they go and work out at the gym, but they don't play basketball together. They don't play softball together except in some big giant annual event. And so these informal ties are missing. And so it is indeed, as the governor said, hard to hate up close. Well, if you're not up close to someone, it's a whole lot easier to hate. Yeah. I think that's kind of what we've seen. And there are other factors as well, but I think that's an important element. What about your experience, Governor Dukakis?
Well, I'll try to keep this reasonably brief, but it's a long one. So I was elected, Chris, for the first time to the legislature in 1962. Massachusetts was one of the 3 or 4 most corrupt states in the country at the time. I mean, I'm not kidding. And I was one of a group of young reformers, Republicans as well as Democrats, who wanted to do something about it. And we worked together for 8 years and cleaned that place up. I mean, it was hard stuff. I was not beloved, let me tell you, by the regulars of either party. Okay, so we work at it. We make some real progress. And in 1974, I run for the governorship. Not with great support. A lot of folks in that building. And I win. The state was in terrible shape, economically and otherwise. And we worked our heads off and took a 12.5% unemployment rate and dropped it to 5% in 4 years. And I'm feeling pretty good. And I'm about 40 points ahead in the polls with 5 weeks to go. And a guy named Ed King, Joe, a Democrat, he subsequently became a Republican. But in any event, runs. Nobody gives him a shot. I think a lot of my folks were a little too overconfident at that point because we'd overcome a lot. And he beat me.
In a primary, Governor?
in a primary. Think about it. Talk about humiliation. Well, okay. So I'm not one of these guys who blames other people. I said, Dukakis, you thought you were doing well. People thought you were doing well. You must have screwed up somehow. And I spent the next 2 or 3 years before I decided, only after a lot of thought, to challenge this guy who had beat me in that election. But we did things a little differently. I mean, we worked the grassroots. We were at it. And I became a much better listener, Chris, the second time around. And one of the things you discover is that, for one thing, listening is a lot less tiring than talking. And secondly, you learn things.
You know,
and
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. And I'll try to wrap this up. And I not only became a better listener, and not only defeated the guy that had beaten me in that primary, but subsequently won fairly easily in the final. But it struck me that maybe, and I'm sure you went through the same thing, Chris, maybe as governor, I might ask people to come together and see if we could solve some problems together. Even people who had not been supporters of mine. And that included some Democrats.
That's terrific. As you two
And
were
what
talking-
happened, and I'll wrap up with this, what happened was that we were so successful with these working groups, as I call them, that we never went down the policy road without creating a working group made up of people, some of whom liked me, some of whom maybe didn't like me. But what you discover is that as governor, you can ask people to come together, and very few of them, I don't remember anybody saying, screw you, governor, I'm not going to participate in your work. If the governor calls and says, I want you to be part of this, 99 times out of 100, they're going to be part of it. And we had enormous success. I teach this stuff these days. We had enormous success at creating these working groups, usually bipartisan. And what did we discover? That with rare exceptions, I mean, who doesn't think that working Americans and their families should have decent, affordable health care?
Right.
Once people say, hey, we want to be part of this, then it's a question of trying to come up with a solution. And literally, from that point on, every time we had a problem, working group, good staff, extremely helpful, and with rare exceptions, we solved a lot of problems and had a very successful next 8 years.
So great. Well, as the two of you were talking, I was reminded of something I've been telling my students, and that is, these days, I think young people have to sort of step up, because I think anyone over 60, and I'm in that category now, probably has screwed things up to the point where we need some new ideas. And Julia is not only a poli-sci major, but she's also a minor in public and community service studies, where they actually look into these questions. Julia, do you have are you seeing some connections to your work in PSP as well as PSC, public and community service?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like Governor Christie said, it boils down to personal relations at the end of the day. Whether you're working with a community organization, working with a group of people in politics, in service at a nonprofit, you have to get to know who you're working with. Otherwise, no work is going to be able to get done. And I think, my generation of young people, we are extremely passionate about a lot of prominent political issues like bipartisanship. We see that there's a problem. But as young people, we're also unsure a lot of times about what we can do about it. What avenues can we take to make our voice heard, that go beyond just casting a vote, which we know is so important. But a lot of the times I think there's kind of a disconnect with what actually can young people do to make an impact. So I don't know if you two have any thoughts on this, but I would love to hear, what advice would you give young people or anyone who's looking to become really active and engaged, especially in an election year like this? Governor Dukakis, I'd love to hear from you first.
I think it's a question of political leaders, mayors, governors, presidents, reaching out and saying to folks, please come, I need your help. I'm sure you did that, Chris, often. I did it often. And it worked so fantastically well that it became a standard operating procedure. We'd create a working group, try to make it broadly representative. And what we discovered, Judy, interestingly enough, was that with very rare exceptions, yes, there is a handful of issues where for either moral or other reasons people feel very strongly, and okay, that's fine. But who doesn't think that working Americans and their families should have decent, affordable health care? I mean, is there anybody that says, no, we don't want to do that? And I found that with rare exceptions, bringing good people together, inviting them to be part of this. I don't remember everybody saying, screw you, governor, I'm not participating. I'm not interested. If the governor, Chris, asks, people usually will say, yeah, okay, sure. I mean, they're surprised when you ask them. But once you ask them, they're there. And we had enormous success at putting these working groups together and coming up with real consensus on very important issues. Now, how many folks do this in politics these days? I don't know. You don't get a sense in Washington that anybody's creating working groups about anything. But they certainly worked for me. They obviously worked for you, Chris. And that's the way you get things done, at least in my experience.
I think that's true. And Julie, I tell you that, like, for young people, what I say to them all the time when they ask me for advice on how to get involved and all the rest, it's a variant off of what Governor Dukakis was saying. It's showing up. There's not an overabundance of talent in public life right now. And I don't think there ever has been an overabundance of talent. I think that there's always a place for someone, a new young person, to come in and start to work their way into positions of leadership. But it's showing up. You got to be there. You got to be part of it. And, you can start off by working for a cause you really care about, or working for a candidate that you really admire and support. Those are both really great things, because two things happen. One, it's great work and you get into a campaign. And I remember that first campaign I worked on in 1977 when Tom Kean lost the primary for governor. I was heartbroken. I mean, I just thought the world had come to an end. And I remember him seeing a group of us the next day. And what I noticed, it was a huge lesson. I looked at him, he was fine. He wasn't distraught. He wasn't depressed. He was talking about what he was going to do next. So you learn those lessons of resilience in this business as well. And, Governor Dukakis, kind of glossed over it, but it's no fun losing an election. I've lost them. He's lost them. But what it also teaches you, and you're a young person, you're involved in those campaigns, is that, you can make a difference for that candidate. You can make a difference for your town, your county, your state, your country. But you got to show up and start working at it. And when you do, and you're really talented, believe me, everybody notices. You see that young person who's working harder, smarter, articulate, all the rest. You find a spot in the next campaign for that person, the next one, and the next one, because talent just always comes to the top. And I especially see it in our business for young people. So I'd say to young folks, go in there and get involved. And I don't care. It doesn't have to be a candidate. You don't have to be a candidate yourself. It could be for a cause, or it could be for someone else. Or if you're really daring, be a candidate yourself and go out there and try to get something done. It's exhilarating stuff. It's hard, but it's exhilarating.
And Chris, I've often said this. This is the most open political system in the world, Julia. You don't have to buy a ticket. You don't have to ask somebody for permission. I mean, we have these representative town meetings in large Massachusetts towns. The first office I ever ran for was as a member of the town meeting, 240 people, as the governing body in the town of Brookline, Massachusetts, a town of about 60,000 people. What did I do? I printed up some cards, went out and rang every doorbell in the precinct, stood in front of the polling place for 13 hours and got elected. That was the beginning of my political career. Well, people said, hey, this guy Dukakis, I mean, kind of a funny name. The Greek vote was not a big one in the town of Brookline, but that was the beginning. And then gradually, you know, other people kind of recognized that maybe this is somebody that they should help. Forget about support, just involve.
Yeah.
As Chris said, and before you know it, you're working at it, involved, and people begin to recognize that you've got some energy and talent. And there we go. It's not difficult.
Absolutely.
In fact, you know, you're usually welcomed into the system.
Yep.
And I'm sure that was your experience, and it was certainly my experience.
It was.
Yeah, absolutely.
When Tom Kane met you, he didn't say "see you later," right?
Yeah. Put me in the back of his car.
He said, "Get in the car. Let's go
to Paramus.
To a meeting."
I do think, by the way, that people who are running for office and people who are involved in campaigns are looking for people. They're actually recruiting young people because that's how everybody I know who's gotten into politics is somebody saw them and decided to mentor them. So I think that's important. Now, Julie, is it time that we go to the questions from the people sort of listening in?
Yes, so we're going to pivot a little bit. We had a really high number of submissions from the audience tonight. They have some questions they'd like to ask you both. So we'll kind of do like a little bit of a lightning round, but there's a lot of really good stuff. So one of the questions coming from one of our Providence alumni from the class of 2012 was, how do you think COVID-19 has altered the landscape for governors in terms of how they utilize their power? Governor Christie, would you like to take a stab at that one?
Sure. Listen, in a state of emergency, governors have extraordinary authority. And really the question is, how do you want to use it? And are you perceived to be using it effectively? We had this with Hurricane Sandy in 2012, and it was the second worst natural disaster in the country's history. If people think you're being reasonable and transparent with them, they're going to want you to take charge as a governor. And that's what makes this job, the job of being a governor, one of the best ones, because you can really, really have an impact on people's lives, and people also want you to do it. They want they look to the governor to make those decisions. So I think in COVID, it's very much the same thing, although even more complicated than a natural disaster because it's an ongoing disaster. It's like another little bit of the hurricane comes every day. Where with Sandy, it all came in one day, and then you had to deal with the aftermath.
I just add one other thing to what Chris said. Picking good people is the most important thing you'll do as a chief executive. And we happen to be governors of states with a lot of talented people.
Yep.
Who I think will respond, Chris, to a governor who says, "Hey, I need you."
Yep.
But it's so important. I don't want to get into the current political situation in Washington or any other place, but you don't get a sense that people are looking for highly talented folks. And let me tell you, I had, and I'm sure you did too, I had great people working for me. But let me tell you, without them,
no.
You can make a million speeches, but you're going to get killed when it comes to performance.
You're darn right, Governor. And listen, it is the single most difficult thing you do and the single most important thing you do.
Yeah.
Yep.
No question about it.
Yep.
No question.
Absolutely. So this next one kind of touches on a really hot topic in our nation right now. It comes from a parent from the class of 2021. So because the next presidential election is right around the corner, do you believe the next elected president of the United States, in order to represent the will of the American people, should have the right to nominate the next Supreme Court justice? Governor Dukakis, why don't you start us off with this one?
Well, I'm a little conflicted on it. I mean, I thought what happened to Merrick Garland was outrageous. On the other hand, there comes a point, I think, when you're really very close to the process of appointment, and in this case, a presidential campaign, where it may make more sense to say, okay, let's hold it, let's see what happens. If the incumbent is reelected, not a problem. If he or she is not, well, raises interesting questions. And I would say this, no matter who the president is, no matter what party controls and so forth. But for at least a substantial period of time until fairly close to the election, look, it's the president's responsibility to go out and pick good people, especially when it comes to judiciary, and for the Senate to do its job. But at some point, and I can't tell you at this point, I haven't really kind of thought through this as thoroughly as I should have. There comes a point when I think maybe, no matter who the president is, you back off, wait until the election is held. If you're reelected, you're fine. If you're not, well, got a different
choice
set of circumstances.
You know,
Chris, I don't know how you feel about this, but
you know, I think it goes back to the point Joe was making earlier about the bipartisanship. You know, it wasn't that long ago, Governor. 1986, Antonin Scalia was confirmed 94-0.
my classmate at Harvard Law School.
There you go. Pretty amazing, right? And then yet you had Ruth Bader Ginsburg confirmed 93-4. You know, these are people who have very strong views on one side of the philosophical spectrum or the other, and people just made these decisions based upon the merit, the qualification of the person in front of them. We have come to such, and I think it really started with Robert Bork and went on from there, and people hold grudges over decades in these parties, you know, and you saw it happen with him, you saw it happen, you know, with Robert, with Harry Reid changing the votes on the filibuster for circuit court judges because he didn't like what Republicans were doing there. Republicans then changed it for Supreme Court justices. And when you get rid of the filibuster, it doesn't force anybody to have to pick someone who can reach across the aisle and get votes. Now all you have to do is get to 50 or 51, depending on who's sitting in the vice president's chair. So in this current context, I'm okay with them doing it because I think it's become so divided that, well, you know, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. It's going to come back to get you later on. And I no doubt the Democrats will lie in wait for their opportunity to do it. I don't like that. I don't approve of it. But I think both parties have contributed to this really rancorous conduct. And it doesn't make our country better. It really
not only that, Chris, you never know what these folks are going to do.
No, you and I know that.
I mean, look at the current chief.
Yep.
Very conservative guy, but he's become a kind of consensus builder.
Yep.
I mean, a peacemaker of sorts. And I think it's because he feels a very strong need to do that as the chief.
So I appreciate everything you're saying, but I do have a question. You know, I'm reminded of Mahatma Gandhi's saying, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. And I'm wondering when this sort of appointment mess stops, because, you know, I tell my students, look, there's a constitutional right to confirm the current appointment before the election, after the election, the Constitution allows it. But just because you have the liberty to do something doesn't mean you should do it. That there's a liberty license distinction that Edmund Burke talked about. And I'm really worried that tit for tat will lead to court packing.
Well, listen, I'm concerned about it too, Joe, and I think this is where presidential leadership comes in, and I think that you know, whoever the next president is going to have to really think about how they want to proceed from here, because you know it's and I did this as governor. You know, we had a lot of fights over our Supreme Court with the Democratic Senate and the Republican governor, but I filled every one of those seats ultimately and got them all confirmed. Now, they weren't always my first choice, but they were consensus choices that were able to get done.
And good people. And
yes.
Good people. I remember looking at the folks who were being appointed to the state Supreme Court in New Jersey, and they all seemed to me to be, I mean, as best I could tell, I mean, I wasn't spending an enormous amount of time on this, but you were able to attract some really good people, and so were your predecessors. I mean, we looked at the Jersey Supreme Court with a good deal of respect and admiration.
It's always had a great reputation, and in the end, we were forced to reach consensus. And I think, though, I didn't have to reach consensus if I didn't want to. I could have continued the fight, but I think that it's about executive leadership. And in the end, we're going to need a president who's willing to say enough of the nonsense now. We're going to work together to do this. And that takes some guts, because the people in your own party, a lot of them aren't going to like hearing that. And a lot of the people in my party didn't like it when I compromised on Supreme Court justices in New Jersey, because they're like, well, it's our turn now. And I said, well, but the people have selected divided government. We got to work together to be able to get things done. So I think, Joe, I'm concerned about the same thing you are, but I think it's going to take executive leadership to be able to make that change.
Great. Julia, is there time for one more?
Yeah, I think this actually ties in really nicely to the last question that we can ask this evening. So this is from a member of the class of 2004, and they would like to know, in the midst of everything going on, we know that there is so much going on right now in our country. How do we look to strengthen our democratic institutions post-2020? Kind of a loaded question, but Governor Dukakis, if you want to try and take that.
Yeah, give that one to Dukakis.
Look, I'll try to avoid the present political situation,
Sure.
which I find appalling. But if we happen to have a new president, one of the things I would advise him to do is to pull together, Chris, a bipartisan group of highly respected people who sit down, Julia, and work through this thing. Because I agree with you. I mean, we're not headed in the right direction here. You know, it's become so political, so contentious. And that's not where we ought to be. Not only that, but to repeat, these folks that are appointed to the court may or may not do what you think they are going to do. I mean, we've had all kinds of situations in which people who were left or right or conservative or liberal or whatever ended up doing interesting things. I offer the current chief,
Yep.
who has surprised all kinds of people by writing opinions and handing down decisions which nobody expected him to do. I've got a daughter who's a reporter for Colorado Public Radio, and we were talking about this guy Gorsuch when he was nominated. Well, he's handed down some rather interesting decisions lately, which nobody expected him to do. So I think this would be a great subject for a new president, if we have one, to pull together, Chris, one of these genuinely bipartisan groups and say, come on, let's see if we can work out some guidelines here for not only me, whoever the president is, but future administrations that can help us to get back to what we hope is a genuinely nonpartisan, merit-based system. And I'm optimistic enough to believe that we can do that, but it will take important presidential leadership, no question about it.
Listen, I totally agree, Governor, that the only way this happens, as I said before, is presidential leadership in our system. You know, one of the things we were talking about, the lack of bipartisanship before, I do think that gerrymandering is one of the biggest reasons why we don't have bipartisanship.
Terrible.
You just don't have any competitive districts anymore, very few. And so everyone's just worried about the primary. Think it by their primary, their district is so stacked that it's done. And when you then go to Washington, the Democrats are only worried about making sure they make the left happy, because heck, that's who I'm going to get a challenge from in the primary that would be effective. And the same thing with the Republicans. They go further right because, well, heck, that's the only way I can lose. And so, you know, gerrymandering, I think, is another important part of what we need to look at as a country and say, isn't it better to have competitive districts? Isn't it better to have districts where people really have to fight based on their record to get something done? And I think a new president should really look at with Congress the issue. Now, this won't be popular in Congress because, geez, those people, the thing I always used to tease, both the governor and I have never been in the Congress, and we're executive guys. We both ran for president. So, we didn't, I think, have an interest in being in the House or the Senate for a whole bunch of reasons. But they're all, the thing they love the most about being in Congress is being called congressman. And if you don't get called congressman or senator anymore, if you lose. So, we have to get folks together to say the institution and this country is more important, and that people are losing their faith in the fact that government can do what it says it wants to do and is supposed to do. And I remember back, the governor and I were talking about this before we got on with the broader group. I remember 32 years ago when he was the Democratic nominee for president. And listen, the reason he was, in my opinion, was because of his extraordinary record as governor. I mean, people looked at it and said, geez, this guy might actually be able to run the country. Regardless of whether they agreed with him or they didn't philosophically on issues, I think he won that nomination because he certainly was not anywhere near the most liberal guy in his primary race, for certain. And he wasn't the best known guy going in. But that record, I remember that campaign of being the most effective governor in America. We got to get back to where we care about how effective people are rather than how good they are on cable television.
Yeah.
And that, I think, Joe, is going to require some different type of presidential leadership than we've had of late. And it's going to take members of Congress being willing to put themselves at risk for the country. And, like Governor Dukakis said, I'll end my sermon on this. I'm a hopeless optimist. I love this country, and there's no place on earth I'd rather be. And when you travel around the world, there's no place on earth those folks, if they were going to go someplace else in the world, they'd rather be than here. So yeah, we have problems and we have division, and there's been some very difficult times of late. But you know what? I believe in this country and I believe in its people. And when I see people like Julia, it gives me a lot of confidence that there's the cavalry is coming over the rise to relieve Dukakis and I of our burdens here and come and take over. And that's a great thing.
And Julia, it's now your burden to focus on substance over style, because that's what they were just talking about, that you need to be substantive and not symbolic. And that's what I try to tell my students. We need substantive. And that also requires that we as citizens engage, and we engage substantively, not stylistically.
Since I'm the Republican on this call, I will say this. I ran in 2016 for president. And I laugh now when I hear leaders of the media in this country bemoan the fact that Donald Trump is president, because they made him. I'll tell you one story. I was sitting in, and I'm sure Governor Dukakis had this experience, sitting in that Marriott in Des Moines after 3 town meetings and getting up there, no room service, ordering a Domino's pizza. And I turned on the TV set, and CNN was doing an hour-long live feed of Donald Trump's speech from Alabama. I had met 900 people that day in 3 town hall meetings. Donald Trump was getting to 900,000 on that. And so I remember seeing Jeff Zucker after Trump won. And he said, "This is your fault. You endorsed him after you dropped out of the race." And I said, "Doctor, heal thyself." And so, the media also has to be a part of this in our country the way it is now. They have to be willing to reward the right things. And Joe, they haven't been. And a guy like Mike Dukakis, I'd say today, would have much less a chance because of this media of being the Democratic nominee for president than he did 32 years ago.
Without a doubt. We are out of time, but again, I think that we've come to a pretty good consensus that we need to understand that public service is serving others, it's not serving ourselves. I think we need to understand that we have to step up, and that sometimes means going out of our comfort zone. I think everybody who's watched Julia understands we need to let younger people sort of into this, because they have a different perspective that isn't quite as destructive as my generation, which is the late baby boomers. And the only way to do it is for all of us to realize being a citizen isn't like being a consumer, it's being a citizen. And so I had a fantastic time. I appreciate the time that you've spent with us. Wonderful thoughts, and I'd like to thank you.
Joe, can I say one other thing? Don't let anybody tell you that you can't do the job with integrity and honesty.
Yeah,
You better plan to live moderately. If you want to make a lot of money, don't go into politics.
that's right.
But there's nothing like it. The satisfaction that the governor and I have talked about tonight is huge, and it's an incredible life.
Yeah.
And we encourage all of you to take it seriously and get involved.
We do. And I want to say, Joe, thank you for giving me the opportunity to spend this last hour with Governor Dukakis. He is an extraordinary public servant. And gosh, we said we couldn't believe we hadn't met each other up to this point, but we haven't.
Yeah.
It's an honor. I've watched him. He was an extraordinary leader. And, having run for president too, it ain't easy. And for somebody like him to have gotten his party's nomination and been able to run the state that he did the way he did, Governor, it's an honor to be with you tonight.
And I feel the same way, Chris. A Greek and an Italian
That's right.
working together. I mean,
Keep it going.
what could be better than that?
Nothing better.
And I didn't even get a chance to tell the story of my research assistant who saw you painting mailboxes in Brookline once.
Well,
But anyway, but thank you.
I hate graffiti.
Yeah,
Not a secret. I hate graffiti.
That's a true story. Like
Yeah, that's
Sam, who is from Brookline, saw you painting a mailbox.
Can't
So
stand
thank
it.
you so much. It's been a wonderful time. And Julia, thanks. Do you have any parting words, Julia?
Yeah, thank you.
I would just say thank you both for your time tonight, your stories. I think that's one of my favorite parts about politics is just hearing those stories about the personal relationships you've made along the way. And to any of my fellow students out there, I think what we can walk away from tonight is show up, surround yourself with good people, and be willing to do the work because it's on us now to kind of continue the work of the people that have come before us. So thank you both so much for your time. It was great to be with you tonight. So thank you.
Thank you for
Thanks
having
to
us.
all the people who showed up and to college events and the college, which is doing an amazing job these days. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you, Governor.
Take care.
Thank you, Governor.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Providence College Podcast. To learn more about all the virtual events we are offering this month for Homecoming at Home, please visit homecoming.providence.edu. You can find the Providence College Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and your smart speaker. Feedback is welcome by emailing podcast@providence.edu.